My name never suited me much. There were times when I considered changing it, and though I've had nom de plume and pseudonyms aplenty, I was always hesitant to make a more permanent change, lest I was ridiculed by those who knew me well. At this point in my life, I am sure enough to say that I am at heart a very insecure person, a contradiction which may or may not be true of others who have had similarly delusional ambitions. I am also someone who physically bristles at being told that I cannot accomplish something. Who tells me this? Mostly me, myself and I, the one most consistently called Agatha. I am seldom out of a state of motion. Those two selves exist by that definition. The one, the ambitious, feels real as I am thrust towards a goal. The other, the insecure, cannot help but feel like the truly authentic when I am forced to be at rest. But enough psychology. My story is truly inextricable from a handful of people, no more. But my beginnings really only to one, perhaps two. The two are not my parents, for we, my twin brother and I, have slim to no memory of either father or mother, though we are told we had both. My brother, Vicius, or Netto for short, never could recall their presence. But I've always sworn that my earliest memory was outside a low-thatched hut watching what would have been my father chop wood as I sat by possibly a chicken coop. I remember laughing every time he split the wood and him laughing with me. If I were to further fictionalise this wisp of a memory, I would have it that we laughed and chopped wood from dusk, all the way to night time, our bellies aching, filling the forest night with our sounds high and low. I think it is why I am most comfortable in a dark forest. It is also perhaps why I have seldom ever laughed since. We grew up with what we knew as our aunt. From a young age, she told us simply our parents had to leave and we were better off without them, and would entertain no follow-up questions when we in our trembling little voices asked them. Neither particularly strict nor particularly loving, it shouldn't have been a surprise when at the age of something like 12 we saw her pack her things and leave with a group of mysterious travellers. We never even knew if she was our mother or our father's sister, so bereft we were of knowledge of what defined a family. In retrospect, which I've had plenty of, she left us in our small abode, perhaps a bit bewildered. Although we lived in an organised settlement, barely a town, at that age I already was naturally quick to think of solutions. The next time a familiar passing band of knights took refuge in our small community, I dragged my brother in a bouquet of wildflowers and picked out the strongest and most trustworthy-looking chevalier and made a grandiose display of greeting him in our native dialect as Papa. It was enough to cement our place in the settlement as bastard children and assured us some sense of safety until we could grow into ourselves a bit. Was I ever a child? Or perhaps will I ever not be one, is the question I'm too afraid to ask. I don't mean, of course, in terms of competence or ability to navigate the world, but that sense of alienation. Like everything is too new. It certainly is an abstract thought for someone who has lived as long as I have, but it's the only way I can express it. A word encompassing something like wondrous terror or terrified wonder. My brother and I never needed to speak much. We seldom fought and communicated almost telepathically. Still, we had varying interests, and perhaps as the more thoughtful and plan-oriented of the two, I tended to take charge and act as an older sibling, even though, who knows, perhaps he had been born a few minutes before me. We looked frighteningly similar until we were 9 or 10, both of us keeping our hair long, but after our aunt left, I convinced him to cut his hair shorter and assume a more manly appearance. That was the start of our realising that we were not one person in two forms, but two very different creatures, our gender being only the half of it. The other person I spoke of was not my aunt, bless her. We no doubt would have been far worse off or dead without her, but I'm not too ashamed to say I felt and feel very little for her. Perhaps it was the lack of tenderness, or perhaps the brazen abandonment, but in short, she is not the other character in this story. She happened to us when we were something like 18 years of age, though in those days we did not count time the same, if at all. When Netto arrived back at our lodging, his neck wrapped in a cloth black with his blood, I came face to face with my gravest fear, that of losing my brother. I was too in shock to start to place what had happened to him, but as he began to recover, and more pressingly as the supernatural effects of his experience manifested themselves, all my learnings of the lore of our place of birth came into sharp focus. There was no talk of vampire in those days, but there was talk of her. She appeared to men who were lost in the woods. She had a house that would be there and gone when next you searched it out. One old woman in the settlement spoke to me about immortality and that she fed on the necks of men, but if the man did survive, then they too would become immortal. Some say the men who disappeared became immortal and were sent by her to find their own territory. But others spoke that she made use of their bodies and bones and made magic out of them. She was called Baba by this woman, Baba Yaginya. I wish I could bottle what gave me the courage to face her. Something in my brother's visage now inexorably changed, the irises fluctuating in colour, his veins fluttering with what looked like tiny bats. He was suddenly unfamiliar. It felt like I'd already lost him. Perhaps I was also jealous. Jealous that he would have the opportunity to explore the greater world through time and space and to make something of himself. Though I knew his love for me, I feared the abandonment. I feared too, perhaps, that he would be just fine without me. In reflection, I needed him to need me, to see me as useful in his journey. As much as I was the protector, the provider, he had a strength that was always mysterious to me, one that seemed to look at the world as one that possessed more beauty than horror. So, I took what would become my familiar path. I went into the horror. The woman in the village gave me a tincture for him to sleep for as long as it took me. I did not even think to wish him goodbye. That possibility was outside the question. The chimney pouted smoke I could smell, what Netto had described so vividly in his fevered state. A hearty stew, seasoned with pungent herbs. Someone that flavoured so well surely could not be truly evil, I thought, attempting to steady my shaking hands. I knocked on the door and took several steps back before the landing. The woman who appeared looked younger than I expected, taller as well. Had Netto described her accurately? She could have been my mother's age, perhaps only a bit more. Where was the crone of Netto's telling? Her dress was like he described, though, odd and fairy-like, torn and accented with dyed lengths of frayed fabric. She spoke in an ancient dialect which, though it was close enough to our tongue, was difficult to discern at times. "Who are you? What do you want?" she said. In her dialect it would have been more like who, want, what. I swallowed hard, shaking and trying hard not to regret my decision. Part of me wanted to turn and run back through the forest, run back to Netto and continue on, find a way to cope with our new reality, but I knew it was against my nature. If I was gone today, I would be back tomorrow. I used an old word, one that meant twin, but also literally cursed twin. An old belief that twins are unnatural, perhaps due to their killing the mother in childbirth, which I knew we had not done, at least according to our aunt. She looked at me, my intense stare begging for her understanding, and then she laughed, a happy but fearsome laugh. She turned and walked inside, leaving the door ajar. I know not how many have offered themselves as I did. Surely it is an origin story for some, though I haven't heard of it before or after me. It would be a kind of incalculably foolish Russian roulette with a chamber of 1,000 to 999 bullets. Baba would not have cared to dissuade me. Still, she took my plight seriously. She treated me kindly and with consideration, fed me, asked where my parents were, asked if I was married, at least as much as I could understand her. Her language was brusque and monosyllabic, and I responded mostly in shrugs and simplified as best I could my speech, so as not to offend. Despite the language barrier, she was no fool. Her house's shelves were filled with vials and pots and herbs and bones and grimoires and odd, fine-looking tools. She gave me a ball of resin to melt into my brother's food, which would bring him back to health faster. Once she had packed it all away for me, she told me when I should come back, showed me by the position of the moon when she would be there. She made it clear that I should return alone. Then she gave me a cup of spiced wine, pricked her finger, bled into it, and had me drink it in one go. And before I had finished, I felt her fangs sink into my neck and her mouth drink from it, a pain so sharp and intense that I remember going into convulsions immediately. Then I saw a vision. Instead of my past flashing before my eyes, in that instant I saw the entirety of what lay before me, all the way to my last moments on this earth. I saw a church in flames, I saw Netto's face and others. I would not know until later. The visions could have lasted an hour, or they could have all have been thrust at me in mere seconds, but in them, I knew that I too had been chosen, that I had made the only choice in coming to her. Then it all turned black. When I awoke, I was on the ground where the house had been. I felt for my neck and found a beeswax-like substance spread over it. I barely had the strength, but the full moon gave me light and courage enough to make my way back home, back to Netto, who was sleeping still. I laid my head on his breast and cried and cried and cried, for I knew that while he would know what I had done, I would never tell him what I had begun. I would never tell him that I had, for at least a time, a mentor, while he would only have the memory of encountering a monster. That secret, that difference would define the shape of our respective journeys. I paid a price to be with him forever. Had I told him the truth, it would simply have made him more suspicious of me from the start, instead of his reluctance to stay within my orbit, or I in his. He never could see that I did not care which it was. I simply had things I wanted to accomplish while I was there. I never knew how old Baba truly was. Only when she said her final goodbyes, wanting to distance herself from an approaching war, did she appear to me close to what Netto experienced. Perhaps she had a vanity, appearing older before a younger woman. I can't say I've been any different. Naturally, our communication during that time was less verbal and more kinetic, if you will. The house itself had a magic, of course, and one day, as she oversaw a new potion made from herbs and mushrooms I'd collected for her, I was surprised to receive her voice's command in my head to fetch one more sprig from a basket. That was the first discovery of my telepathic powers, one that was complicated in its efficacy. Telepathy, as I learned, was a two-way street. Not all could receive my transmissions. As much as I would try, and with great irony, my twin could not receive them. Those who could were special to me. One day, a particularly sweltering mid-afternoon, Baba's shirt hung loose and I glimpsed her neckline and a hanging talisman between her breasts. When she got up, I finally saw what it was. A large tooth, seemingly from a wolf or maybe a bear, gnarled and twisted but still menacingly sharp. When she saw me looking, she tucked it back into her shirt and looked gravely offended. The man could not have been much older than me or Netto. He had long ceased to flail and had fainted from blood loss. Was I thinking less of her when I startled before this scene? My first thought, only to assure myself that it wasn't Netto somehow. My second, to quietly depart and leave her to her ways. To wait on her stoop like the respectful apprentice that I was. Perhaps I knew silence was my tuition. She saw in my expression when she returned that I had been witness to it. We walked inside. She motioned for me to start the kettle. And finally, she spoke. I remember well what she said. for she did not speak in many full sentences. Men, they all eventually do ill. You should mourn them very little. What you saw was as common as a dead chicken. A woman can do more good in a year of life than a man can in his entire. Aside from mentoring me in her ways, I do not know what good Barbara was a part of. Our time spent together was too brief to know what else she influenced, roaming around the country, perhaps the entire earth in her disappearing house. I do know that she helped me nurse Netto back to health remarkably fast, and that her magic helped me in helping many people in the years to come. Perhaps she influenced others too, though it would seem her distaste, no pun intended, for mankind would disqualify them. And since I was perhaps the only vampire of my gender to be bitten by her, well, in any case I did feel special from the first moment until the last, spent in her presence. I felt a deep maternal love that I wished conveyed on the greater world. But not the storybook kind, but a love that was also capable of destruction as much as it was capable of creation, one that would burn the world down if it did not abide by her definition of those ancient laws. The law, she would say. It is the law. The word was the same in both our languages. In our language it also means something else. It means truth. It can also mean the vein of the world.
Can I do anything for you?
Harry says to me. His voice is so tender and measured. It breaks my heart that I cannot receive what it conveys. I respond telepathically to him. No, thank you. But I sense he is not receiving my messages right now. He is closed. This happens sometimes when we've been apart. I should speak, but I'm afraid of what my voice will sound like. It will sound weak. I will sound true. I want him to touch me, to shake me. For a moment I want the beast he was to come out and act like a petulant, destructive child, to take up space in this room, in this void. Instead I sit there, in silence, afraid, ashamed, insecure. I listen to every thump down the steps. He does not, cannot hate me, but I have undone years of his damage. He should hate me, and I have tricked him not to. I am not benevolent, I am self-serving. Hypocrite. I should die. Baba teaches me the concealment spell. It takes years for me to put it into effect. She cautions that I must only put it on a space, and not a person, especially not on myself, unless, she pauses, unless all is lost. Unless you have a way to find yourself again. Something in being immortal means there are long stretches of time where I do not dream. Netto told me once that this was the same for him. He shares when this was, and I say that I too had a gap then, and our likeness fills me with warmth, but I try not to show it. I want to ask him more, see if there are more coincidences, if perhaps this is a sign that we are more alike than different, but I don't get the chance. Still, when I awake from a dream, I imagine that Netto, wherever he is, may also be doing the same, or will be soon, or did so earlier. I dreamt of our father the other day. I do so every 100 years. After the laughter subsides, after the forest begins to come to life, I always find myself looking for Netto while incapable in my little baby form to lift my legs and move, even to crawl with any great efficacy. The ground, the sky, the space around me is like a great quilt encompassing time and space. I think Netto is there somewhere, sleeping, And if I can wake him, he too will remember this moment. He too will remember Father's laughter and the sound of the chopped wood, and he too will banish his fear of the dark forest forever. But he is inside, isn't he? With Mother, presumably in that distance between Father and Mother, between the forest and the home is vast. Suddenly it pulls, stretching at the very fabric of reality, stretching in concert with my heart until we are a thin violin string encompassing the vastness of the earth and vibrating to a tone that is both soothing and shrill depending on my mood, depending on the time I dream that dream. Why did we not ever go looking for our parents? I do not know Neto's reason, nor perhaps if he made the attempt at any point. For my part, I may have gone looking for our aunt first, but something in the life of an immortal makes one doubt in the ability of anyone to change, or perhaps even feel true unimposed regret. If I can barely manage it myself, why should they? I have had many last names, all of them subject to the needs of the time, of the task at hand. But now I think I would like one for myself. Something that defies time. I will sign henceforth Agatha, Vicius. Paris, the 15th of September, 1870.